No one in Hollow Creek ever dared walk past Baker's ranch after dark, let alone linger by the fence line where the weeds clawed at your jeans and the shadows swallowed the world whole. But tonight, dusk pressed heavy on the battered dog pen behind the barn, where courage and cruelty collided and a secret waited in the dark. Chase Roston's smirk was sharper than barbed wire. "Come on, Sophie, just 10 minutes inside. Are you chicken, or what?" His friends hovered behind him, eyes glinting with anticipation, their voices a chorus of jeers and laughter that rippled across the abandoned lot. All it took was a dare, and suddenly Sophie Fletcher was the center of attention, a role she hated more than liverwurst sandwiches or long division. She hesitated, fingers curled around the cool chain link. 11 years old, smaller than the others, she'd learned long ago that standing up to boys like Chase often meant bruises you couldn't see. Still, something inside her, a stubborn flicker, maybe her father's legacy, forced her to raise her chin. "Fine," she muttered, pushing open the squeaky gate. Chase's eyes narrowed. "Hope you like dogs, soldier girl." He spat the nickname with a sneer. No one in town let Sophie forget that her father was gone. Fallen overseas. Just like no one let her forget she was different, quieter, often lost in her own world. She glanced up, the sky bruised purple, the first stars barely visible through the haze of summer's end. The pen was worse than she'd imagined. Faded boards sagged against the weight of time. In the far corner, a battered water bowl glinted dully, half buried in straw. The air stank of rust and old fear. Sophie's heart hammered as she stepped inside, trying not to flinch when the gate rattled behind her. Chase's voice echoed, cruel and triumphant. "Let's see how brave you really are." The gate slammed shut with a jolt that reverberated up her spine. She whirled around, hands flat against the wire, but the lock clicked, a heavy, final sound. On the other side, Chase's friends giggled, one raising a phone, its red light blinking. Sophie knew then that this wasn't just a dare, it was a performance. For them. For the whole school, once the video hit group chat. "Don't worry, he only bites when he's hungry," Chase called out, and the boys exploded into laughter. Sophie felt her cheeks burn, but her pride kept her feet glued to the ground. She would not cry, no matter how much her stomach twisted. Her hand instinctively went to the chain around her neck. Her father's old dog tag. Cool and solid, her anchor in a storm of humiliation. At first, there was only silence. A thick, pulsing quiet broken only by the distant drone of cicadas. Then, from the shadowed far corner, something shifted. A scrape of claws, a heavy, uneven breath. Sophie froze, blood pounding in her ears. Out of the darkness, he emerged. Ranger. The German Shepherd was enormous, every inch of him scarred and battle-worn, his fur patched with grays and memories. He moved with a limp, each step deliberate, as if he measured every inch between them. Sophie wanted to run, to scream, to call for help, but her voice snagged in her throat. Instead, she stood as still as a gravestone, eyes wide, barely daring to breathe. Ranger's gaze found her. His eyes weren't wild, they were ancient, tired. He stopped just shy of arm's reach, head low, ears pricked. Sophie's mind flashed with stories, whispers about the dog who'd mauled a raccoon, the beast Baker left behind when the ranch shut down. But none of those tales prepared her for this moment. Not fury, not snarling teeth, just stillness. A shout from outside. "He's gonna rip her face off." The camera phone's light flickered, the audience growing bolder in the safety of their distance. Sophie swallowed, her legs trembling. She remembered her father's voice. "Never show fear, kid. Dogs smell it faster than rain." But this dog didn't lunge. He didn't even growl. Instead, Ranger sat down, heavy and deliberate. He studied Sophie, head tilting, as if trying to read a language only the broken understood. A long moment passed. Sophie's hand, shaking, reached for the dog tag again, rubbing the engraved letters until her thumb ached. Then, as if some invisible line had been crossed, Ranger shuffled closer. His limp was pronounced, his tail dragging. Sophie's heart thudded so loud she thought the boys must hear it outside. She squeezed her eyes shut, bracing for teeth, for pain, for the rush of shame that would come when she screamed. But all she felt was warmth. Ranger pressed his nose against her knee, then, slow, cautious, he lay down beside her, his battered body curling into the straw. With a heavy sigh, he rested his head on her lap. The world shrank to the soft sound of his breath and the roughness of his fur beneath her fingers. Sophie exhaled, a shuddering release, tears stinging the corners of her eyes. For a moment, the cruelty faded, the taunts, the laughter, even the camera light, drowned out by the gentle trust of a wounded creature. Sophie stroked his head, whispering, "Hey, it's okay. You're safe." Her words, barely audible, seemed to settle him. Ranger's eyes closed, his chest rising and falling, and Sophie felt something unclench inside her, a grief she'd carried since the funeral, since her world changed. Outside, the boys' laughter faltered, uncertain. One of them whispered, "Dude, is he sleeping?" Another, louder, "That's not what was supposed to happen." But the camera stayed rolling, capturing every second the bullied girl and the beast, the unspoken truce. A car's headlights flashed at the end of the driveway. The spell broke. Chase panicked, fumbling with the lock. Sophie heard footsteps pounding away as the other boys scattered, afraid of getting caught. But one classmate, Tommy, smaller, always on the edge of the group, stayed behind, phone still pointed through the wire. His eyes were wide, not with fear, but awe. Sophie met his gaze. Tommy nodded, a silent promise that this moment would not be lost. Sophie didn't care about the video anymore. She just kept stroking Ranger's head, the world narrowing to a quiet she hadn't known in months. For the first time since her father's death, she didn't feel alone. By the time the adults arrived, by the time voices shouted and doors slammed and someone yanked the gate open, Sophie and Ranger were a team. The grown-ups saw only a strange girl, dusty and tear-streaked, cradling a dangerous dog in her arms. But the truth was already spreading, captured in digital memory, waiting to ignite the town. And as the sun dipped below the horizon, Sophie looked up at the sky, clutching her father's tag, Ranger's warmth anchoring her to the earth. She had no idea that tonight's dare would change everything, not just for her, but for a wounded dog who'd been waiting for someone to believe he could be more than his scars. Morning light poured over Hollow Creek, painting the sleepy town in gold, but Sophie Fletcher didn't notice the sun. She stood by her window, breath fogging the glass, watching as her phone buzzed and blinked with a flood of notifications. Her name, her face, and that moment with Ranger, now the talk of the town. The video from last night had spread faster than wildfire in August, carried by group chats, parents, and rumor. In less than 12 hours, Sophie had become both a hero and a villain, depending on who was watching. At school, the whispers started before she even made it past the flagpole. "That's her, the girl from the video. Did she really tame that monster? My dad says the dog should be put down." Sophie kept her chin tucked, clutching her backpack straps, the familiar safety of routine shattered by a digital spotlight, Ranger's head on her lap, that strange peace, now twisted into fuel for town gossip and grown-up arguments. Inside Hollow Creek Middle School, the hallways throbbed with attention. Sophie's friendless reputation offered no shield now. Kids clustered around lockers, phones in hand, replaying the footage over and over. Some cheered, impressed, even a little jealous. Others sneered, echoing their parents' fear or disgust. One girl, sharp-eyed, leaned into Sophie's path and snapped, "You're not brave, you're just crazy. That dog should have torn your arm off." Sophie swallowed hard, the echo of her father's voice steady in her mind. "You don't have to win every fight, kid. Just stand tall through the storm." She kept walking, shoulders squared, eyes burning. In the crowd, she spotted Tommy, the only witness who'd stayed. He met her gaze, guilt flickering behind his glasses. Sophie gave him the smallest nod. The video wasn't his fault. Not really. Chase and the others, though, they skulked in corners, watching to see if the spotlight would burn Sophie or set them free. But the real storm brewed outside the school, in kitchens and town hallways, fueled by grown-ups who'd seen the clip. At the bakery, over plates of donuts and coffee, the story twisted and spread. "Did you see what that animal did?" That girl has no sense, letting a beast like that near her. Maybe she's got a death wish, like her father. And in the center of it all was the question, what should be done about Ranger? Some called Sophie brave, a girl who faced down a monster and found its heart. Others, louder, demanded action. The town had seen too many stories on the news. Dangerous dogs, tragic accidents. Fear was a spark, and Chase's father, Councilman Jim Roston, fanned it with practiced skill. The next day, Sophie and her grandmother, Evelyn, were called to the sheriff's office. The place smelled of coffee and old leather, walls lined with faded photos of parades and lost dogs. Sophie kept her hand clenched around her father's dog tag, the metal pressed into her palm like a secret promise. Across the room, Councilman Arston paced, his suit too sharp for such a small town, eyes cold and calculating. "Sheriff, we can't risk that animal attacking a child," Jim declared, slapping a folder of incident reports on the desk. "It's already growled at a toddler, my nephew, last fall, no telling what it'll do next." His voice rang with authority, but Sophie saw Chase lurking in the hall, face pinched and anxious. The story of that attack was a lie, Sophie remembered hearing about it. The dog had barked once, nothing more, but fear didn't need facts. Sheriff Cooper, old and tired, thumbed through the papers, sighing. "There's no record of a bite," he murmured, glancing at Evelyn, "but folks are scared." Evelyn's jaw set. "That's not the dog's fault, it's the stories people tell." Just then, the door creaked open, and in stepped Rachel Boone, the town's veterinarian, boots dusty, eyes gentle but sharp. She held a copy of the video, freeze-framed on Ranger's face as he lay his head in Sophie's lap. "I know that dog," Rachel said quietly, her voice carrying through the room. "That's Ranger. He served overseas. He was Ben Fletcher's partner." The words dropped like stones. Sophie blinked, surprised. Rachel nodded at her. "Your father and Ranger were inseparable. That dog's not a threat. He's a hero." Jim Roston scoffed. "A dog's a dog, Rachel. War changes them, makes them dangerous." But Rachel held firm. "War can make humans dangerous too, Jim. Doesn't mean we put them down." A pause. Sophie's heart thudded as she remembered a photo of her dad, younger, grinning beside a proud, strong shepherd in desert camouflage. That was Ranger. The truth was finally out, but it only made the stakes higher. The sheriff shook his head, torn. "We need to think about what's best for everyone. Sophie, you'll need to keep Ranger at home until this is sorted. No walks, no visits. And Councilman Roston," he added, "there'll be no more spreading rumors. Let's keep this civil." Outside, Sophie and Evelyn walked in silence. When they reached the truck, Sophie finally whispered, "He knew Dad. Why doesn't anyone care?" Evelyn wrapped her in a hug, fierce and trembling. "People are afraid of what they don't understand, honey. But you understand him. That matters." That night, the town's arguments grew louder. Social media buzzed with accusations and defenses. Some neighbors dropped off casseroles, little acts of support. Others glared from behind curtains. Even the local news ran a story, ending with an image of Ranger, eyes haunted and noble, and a question hanging in the air. Does a hero ever really come home? Meanwhile, Chase's home was tense. His father barked orders, waving the printed video as if it were evidence in a trial. "You embarrass the family," he snapped. Chase stared at his shoes, not meeting his father's glare. He knew what really happened in the pen, but fear made him small. Tommy's phone kept buzzing with demands for the rest of the story, but the truth was tangled in pride and lies. Rachel Boone, for her part, drove out to Baker's Ranch after dinner, parking in the twilight to watch the pen. She saw Ranger's shape, outlined in moonlight, ears pricked as Sophie fed him dinner through the bars. Rachel sighed, remembering Ben, brave and gentle, like the dog who'd followed him into hell and somehow come back. In the coming days, the town divided into camps, those who wanted Ranger gone, and those who whispered about mercy. Sophie's only comfort was the steady press of Ranger's nose through the bars, the way his eyes softened when she spoke. She read him her father's old letters, her voice shaking, but Ranger listened, loyal as ever. And in the shadow of the barn, where no one else could see, a fragile trust began to heal two broken hearts. But above them, storm clouds gathered. Councilman Orphan was gathering signatures for a petition to have Ranger euthanized, painting Sophie as reckless, Evelyn as deluded, and Ranger as a ticking time bomb. The town's fear was growing louder than its hope. In the final moments before sleep, Sophie traced the letters on her father's dog tag and made a silent promise to Ranger. I won't let them take you. Not again. Not ever. Outside, in the darkness, the wounded dog watched the house, standing guard, waiting, as he always had, for someone to fight for him. And as dawn crept across Hollow Creek, the battle lines were drawn, not just for Ranger's life, but for what the town was willing to believe about loyalty, bravery, and the power of second chances. Rain battered the tin roof of Evelyn's farmhouse, drumming out a restless rhythm as Hollow Creek simmered with rumor and accusation. Sophie pressed her forehead to the cool window pane in her bedroom, watching rivulets snake down the glass, turning the world outside into a blur of gray. It had been days since the video, days since Ranger's name was spoken with more fear than respect, days since the walls of her world started closing in. Sophie's mind churned with questions circling the same pain. Why had Ranger come back after so long? What had happened in Afghanistan to drive him from the battlefield to this forgotten corner of the world? And what did it mean that he'd chosen her, out of everyone, to trust in that pen? Evelyn's voice called up the stairs, tired and gentle. Sophie, supper's ready. The farmhouse always felt safe, full of the scent of baking bread and old wood. But tonight, the comfort was paper thin. Downstairs, Evelyn set 2 bowls of stew on the table, the lamplight flickering over her lined face. Sophie slid into her seat, the dog tag cool against her chest. For a long moment, they ate in silence. Then, softly, Sophie whispered, Why did he come back, Grandma? Ranger. Why now? Evelyn put down her spoon, her hands trembling as she reached for a battered photo album. She opened it to a page Sophie had stared at 1,000 times. Her father, Ben, beaming in dusty fatigues, arms slung around a younger, sharper Ranger. When your father died, that dog wouldn't leave the camp, Evelyn said, voice thin as spider silk. After the army brought Ben home, Ranger stayed behind, refused to eat, refused to move. The men said he was waiting for something, maybe for Ben, maybe for a command that never came. She traced the edge of the photograph, a tear sparkling on her cheek. Sophie swallowed hard. But why come here? Evelyn closed the album. Grief finds its own path, sweetheart. Sometimes it brings us home, even if we're not sure what we're looking for. The next morning, a break in the rain let Sophie slip outside before sunrise. She crossed the muddy yard to the barn, where Ranger now slept, a silent guardian in the half-light. The barn was musty and cluttered, hay bales stacked along the walls and old tools rusting on hooks. Sophie knelt beside Ranger's battered bed, her heart pounding. You saw him last, didn't you? Her whisper hung in the air, raw and trembling. Ranger lifted his head, ears drooping. His eyes, those old, haunted eyes, met hers with a gentleness she hadn't expected. Sophie hesitated, then leaned close, pressing her forehead to his. I miss him so much. Tears spilled hot down her cheeks, dotting Ranger's fur. The dog licked her hand, slow and deliberate, as if trying to share the weight. She buried her face in his neck, sobs racking her shoulders. Why did everyone else get to say goodbye but me? She choked. The only answer was Ranger's steady heartbeat and the soft sigh of his breath. Outside, the wind rattled the barn doors, echoing the storm in her chest. When her tears finally ran dry, Sophie wiped her face and sat back. Did you keep something of his? She asked, more to herself than to Ranger. The dog stared at her for a moment, then pushed himself up with effort, limping to a dark corner beneath the hay. He dug with his nose, straw scattering. Sophie crawled over, curiosity beating back the ache. From beneath the hay, Ranger nudged a chewed piece of cloth, blue and frayed, stained with time and memory. Sophie's breath caught. She recognized it immediately. Her father's old scarf, the one he'd worn every winter, wrapped around his neck in all her favorite pictures. She lifted it, pressing it to her nose. It smelled of earth, sweat, and something unnameable. Home, maybe. Or love, stretched across oceans and years. Ranger watched her, tail thumping weakly. "You kept this safe, didn't you?" Sophie smiled through her tears, clutching the scarf. "Thank you." The gesture meant more than words could say, a silent promise between two souls marked by loss. As the sun rose higher, light filtered through the cracks in the barn. Sophie and Ranger sat together, the scarf a bridge to the past. It dawned on Sophie that Ranger wasn't just any dog. He was the last witness to her father's final days. He carried his own wounds, invisible but deep, shadows of the war that never left him. The thought both comforted and haunted her. Later, in the farmhouse kitchen, Sophie found Evelyn at the sink, staring out at the empty road. "He brought back Dad's scarf," Sophie said, laying the battered cloth on the table. Evelyn turned, her expression a mixture of pain and wonder. "It's like he knew you needed it," she murmured, brushing the fabric with her fingers. That afternoon, word came that the town council would hold a hearing about Ranger's fate. Rumors flew that the dog was dangerous, that Sophie was being reckless, that someone had to take responsibility. Evelyn's hands shook as she folded laundry, muttering about people who feared what they didn't bother to understand. Sophie paced her room, anger and fear coiling inside her. Why was it so easy for people to hate what they didn't know? Why did everyone see only the scars, never the loyalty? She turned the questions over and over, unable to shake the image of Ranger, curled up beside her father's scarf, lost and found in the same breath. As dusk fell, Sophie returned to the barn. This time, she brought her father's journal, a battered notebook full of stories, sketches, and army hand signals. She read aloud in the fading light, her voice trembling but determined. Ranger listened, head cocked, ears twitching at the sound of familiar commands. "Sit," she said quietly, mimicking a signal from the book. Ranger obeyed, slow but precise. "Down." He lowered himself, eyes never leaving her face. For the first time, hope flickered. Maybe, just maybe, they could learn to understand each other. Maybe the pieces of her father left behind, dog, scarf, words, were enough to build something new. But the past clung to both of them, heavy as wet wool. Sophie fell asleep that night, curled beside Ranger in the barn, the scarf wrapped around them both. In her dreams, her father stood at the edge of a distant field, waving, his silhouette framed by a rising sun. And beside him, always, Ranger, faithful, patient, waiting for the day when grief would loosen its grip and let them run free once more. Morning came too soon, the world unchanged. The threats, the rumors, the council's looming decision, all still there. But Sophie woke with a strange new strength, forged in the quiet company of a dog who remembered everything she'd lost and everything she still had to fight for. The first rays of dawn crept over Hollow Creek, bathing Evelyn's farm in a soft pink light. Sophie was already awake, lying in her small bed, heart pounding in anticipation. The battered hand signal notebook, her father's, rested on her nightstand, corners worn from years of turning. Outside, the world seemed to hold its breath, as if the fate of one dog and one girl would tip the balance between hope and heartbreak for the entire town. Sophie slipped out of bed and padded down the hall, careful not to wake Evelyn. She poured some kibble into a metal bowl, grabbed the scarf Ranger had given her, and headed outside. The morning was crisp, dew sparkling on the grass, birds just beginning to call. In the barn, Ranger lifted his head at the sound of her footsteps, his ears perked, eyes soft with recognition. She knelt beside him, offering the scarf. "You kept this safe for Dad," she murmured, looping the fabric gently around his neck. "Maybe you'll help keep me safe too." Ranger leaned into her touch, tail brushing the straw in slow, steady sweeps. Sophie reached for her father's notebook, flipping it open to the first page, a list of hand signals and simple commands. She traced the familiar diagrams with her finger, her nerves buzzing with both hope and fear. "Okay, Ranger, let's see if you remember." She stood and gave the first signal, fist raised, then lowered. "Sit." Ranger hesitated, cocking his head. Sophie repeated the gesture, this time mimicking the way her father used to move, confident but gentle. Ranger's ears twitched. Then, slowly, he lowered his haunches to the ground. Sophie let out a shaky laugh. "That's it. Good boy." They practiced through the early morning, moving through the old signals. Stay, come, down. At first, Ranger's responses were halting, uncertain, his eyes flicking to Sophie's face, as if searching for her father's spirit in every motion. But soon, something clicked. His movements grew more sure, his tail wagging, a ghost of his former confidence shining through. Sophie rewarded him with gentle scratches behind the ear, her smile brighter than it had been in months. At the edge of the barn, Evelyn watched from the porch, mug of coffee in hand, tears welling in her eyes. She remembered Ben practicing those same signals in the backyard, a much younger Ranger bounding at his heels, Sophie running behind, trying to keep up. For a moment, the old pain was eclipsed by cautious hope, a sense that, somehow, they were all moving forward together. After an hour, Sophie sat cross-legged, in the straw. Ranger flopped beside her, tongue lolling. "You're still a soldier," she whispered, pride swelling in her chest. "Just a little rusty." She showed him the notebook, flipping to a page with a rough sketch of a dog rolling onto its back. Sophie grinned and tried the new hand signal, a circle drawn in the air. Ranger eyed her for a moment, then, as if remembering an old joke, rolled onto his back, exposing his scarred belly. Sophie giggled and scratched him, tears prickling her eyes again. This time with laughter, not grief. The morning sun poured through the barn's broken window, painting them in gold. When breakfast was over, Sophie led Ranger outside, leashless, trusting him to follow. He trotted beside her, alert but relaxed, nose twitching at the scents of hay and wildflowers. She led him to the edge of the fields, where her father's favorite oak tree stood, branches heavy with dew. Sophie sat in the grass, the hand signal notebook open in her lap, Ranger lying at her side, one paw always touching her knee. It was here, beneath that oak, that Sophie first let herself believe Ranger could truly be hers. She told him stories of her father, how he'd once rescued a kitten from a rainstorm, how he'd carried Sophie on his shoulders at the 4th of July parade, how he'd taught her that loyalty mattered more than medals. Ranger listened, eyes never leaving her face, the two of them sharing a silent understanding born of loss and longing. Back at the house, Evelyn watched them from the kitchen window. She wiped her eyes, then picked up the phone. She dialed Rachel Boone, the vet, her voice trembling. "He's responding to her, Rachel. The way he used to respond to Ben. Do you think this could help him heal?" Rachel's answer was quiet but firm. "Sometimes the only thing that can heal a broken heart is another broken heart." Days passed, and the bond between Sophie and Ranger grew stronger. He learned to sleep at her door each night, nose pressed against the wood, standing guard as if the house itself was his mission. When thunder rolled across the hills, he'd nudge her awake, curling close until the storm passed. In the mornings, Sophie would find him waiting at the foot of her bed, eyes bright, tail thumping against the floor. It was as if her presence anchored him, pulling him back from whatever nightmares haunted his sleep. But not everyone was pleased with the change. At school, Chase's taunts grew louder, fueled by jealousy and fear. "Still playing soldier, Fletcher," he sneered in the hallway, his friends snickering behind him. "That mutt's just waiting to snap. You'll see." Sophie ignored them, her confidence growing each day she spent with Ranger. The other kids watched her differently now, some with admiration, others with suspicion. One afternoon, while Sophie practiced signals with Ranger in the front yard, a neighbor approached. The town's mail carrier, Mrs. Dalton. She eyed Ranger warily, clutching her bag close. "He seems different, Sophie." "Calmer, maybe," she admitted, voice uncertain. Sophie nodded, patting Ranger's head. "He just needed someone to trust him again." Mrs. Dalton smiled, a little, and handed Sophie a letter, the first real sign that the town's frost was beginning to thaw. Evelyn hung a new sign on the barn, Ranger's Rest. It was a small gesture, but it meant the world to Sophie. The barn, once a place of sorrow, was now a sanctuary, a place where healing took root in quiet moments and patient gestures. But beneath the hope, tension still simmered. The town council meeting loomed, and the petition to destroy Ranger had gathered more signatures than Sophie could bear to count. Each day, she waited for the mail, dreading the official letter that would decide their fate. Still, she held on to her father's words, whispering them into Ranger's fur every night. "We're strongest when we stand together." One evening, as Sophie and Ranger watched the sunset from the porch, Evelyn joined them, her face etched with both worry and pride. "Whatever happens at that meeting, I want you to know how proud I am," she said, pulling Sophie close. "You've given him a reason to hope again." Sophie smiled, tears in her eyes. "He's given me the same thing, Grandma." As darkness fell, Ranger settled at Sophie's door, the loyalty in his eyes a silent promise. Come what may, they would face it together. The sound of the gavel striking echoed off the old wood-paneled walls of the Hollow Creek Council hearing room, sharper and colder than any church bell. Sophie Fletcher gripped Evelyn's hand as the crowd pressed in. Neighbors, classmates, strangers, all gathered to pass judgment on Ranger. Every seat was filled. Some people carried homemade protest signs. Others muttered under their breath. The scent of coffee and aftershave mixed with tension so thick it made the air heavy. Sophie's heart pounded in her chest as she searched the crowd. She spotted Tommy sitting quietly in the back, his phone in his lap, eyes glued to the floor. Chase Roston lounged beside his father, the councilman, arms folded, smirk unwavering. Rachel Boone, the town vet, stood near the wall, her presence steady as a stone, waiting for her chance to speak. Councilman Jim Roston stood up, adjusting his tie, looking every inch the small-town politician, confident, smooth, and utterly convinced of his own authority. He cleared his throat, holding up a thick folder. "Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for coming tonight. We are here to address a matter of grave concern, the safety of our children and the presence of a dangerous animal in our community." He flicked the folder open and began to read, voice booming. "In the past month alone, there have been multiple incidents involving this animal, chasing bikes, barking aggressively, and, most recently, a supposed attack on a toddler. I have here sworn statements from parents who witnessed these events." He handed the folder to the mayor, who leafed through the papers, frowning. Sophie felt anger flare in her chest. She knew those stories weren't true, or at the very least, weren't the whole truth. She watched as Chase kept his eyes locked on the floor, guilt and fear warring on his face. But he said nothing. "Furthermore," Jim continued, "this animal, Ranger, is a combat veteran. He has been trained for aggression. Even the best soldiers return with scars. We have to ask ourselves if it is safe or fair to expect a traumatized animal to live peacefully among our children." The room buzzed with whispers. Sophie squeezed her sign tighter, hand-painted last night with trembling hands. "He's my dad's partner. He's my protector now." Her palms were sweating, but she forced herself to her feet and marched to the front of the room. "I know people are scared," she began, her voice shaking but loud enough to be heard. "But Ranger isn't dangerous. He saved my dad's life. He saved mine. He just wants to come home." She held the sign high, willing the words to matter. Some people nodded, others looked away. Rachel Boone stepped forward, her voice calm. "I have examined Ranger multiple times since his return. He shows no signs of aggression. If anything, he's skittish and defensive. Understandable, considering all he's been through. These reports," she gestured at the folder, "are based on misunderstandings and, frankly, fear." Jim Roston shot her a glare. "With respect, Rachel, not all of us are willing to take that chance." His gaze swept the crowd, searching for support. Suddenly a quiet voice from the back. "That's not what happened." All eyes turned as Tommy stood, face pale but determined. "I filmed the video in the dog pen. Chase and his friends dared Sophie to go in." Ranger didn't attack her? He protected her? His voice cracked. Chase told everyone a lie so he wouldn't get in trouble. Chase's head snapped up, face flushed. Jim hissed under his breath, but the room had already shifted. A ripple of whispers spread, eyes darting between Chase, Tommy, and Sophie. The mayor cleared his throat, looking more confused than ever. "Thank you, Tommy," the mayor said. "This information will be taken into consideration." But Jim wasn't done. Regardless, the fact remains. We cannot guarantee the safety of our citizens while Ranger remains at large. I move that we schedule a final ruling in 7 days' time. Until then, I request that Ranger be placed under mandatory house restriction. No visitors, no walks, no exceptions. The motion was seconded, and after a tense vote, it passed. Sophie felt the weight of it crush her chest. 7 days. 7 days to prove Ranger deserved to live. As the meeting ended, Evelyn wrapped Sophie in a tight hug. "You were so brave," she whispered, tears shining in her eyes. "Your dad would be proud." Sophie nodded, but her heart ached with worry. The crowd began to filter out, some pausing to offer quiet words of support, others shaking their heads or avoiding her gaze entirely. Outside, Sophie, Evelyn, and Rachel huddled beneath the glow of a street lamp. "They've stacked the deck," Rachel said grimly. "But truth has a way of coming out, Sophie. You just keep being honest. Keep showing them the real Ranger." As they walked home, Chase caught up, grabbing Sophie's arm. "You have to believe me. I didn't want this. My dad, he just gets so angry. I never meant for it to go this far." Sophie pulled her arm free, voice cold. "You could have told the truth a long time ago." Chase looked away, shame burning in his cheeks. Back at home, Ranger lay by the door, tail thumping weakly as Sophie approached. She knelt, wrapping her arms around his broad neck. "We've got 1 week," she whispered into his fur. 1 week, to show them who you really are." The days that followed were long and lonely. Ranger was confined to the house and yard, neighbors' eyes following every move. Some people crossed the street to avoid Sophie and her grandmother. Others sent cards, "Hang in there," or dropped off baked goods as quiet support. Each night, Sophie lay awake, counting the hours, listening to Ranger's soft breathing at her door. She read her father's journal, looking for strength. She talked to Ranger about everything, her hopes, her fears, her favorite memories of Dad. The dog listened, always, his loyalty unbroken. On the 4th day, a group of kids gathered outside the fence, shouting cruel things. "Monster! Killer!" Sophie's anger boiled over. She stood on the porch, hands clenched, voice shaking with fury. "You're wrong about him. You don't know anything." But the words blew away on the wind, lost to their laughter. That evening, as the sky blushed with sunset, Evelyn handed Sophie an envelope. "It's from Tommy," she said softly. Inside was a note. "I'm sorry for not speaking up sooner. I'll testify if you need me. Ranger deserves better. So do you." Sophie smiled through her tears. Maybe, just maybe, the tide could turn. As the 7th day approached, tension reached a fever pitch. The house was full of worry, but also a fierce kind of hope. Sophie and Ranger sat together every night, watching the stars, sharing a silent promise. They would fight together, no matter the outcome. And somewhere deep inside, a spark of courage began to grow. Because even if the town turned its back, Sophie knew the truth about loyalty, and she would spend her last ounce of strength proving that Ranger wasn't just a survivor. He was her family. The days leading up to the final ruling stretched endlessly, each hour hanging heavy in the air like a storm that refused to break. Sophie counted them in heartbeats, 7 days, then 6, then 5. Her world shrinking to the creak of floorboards, the click of Ranger's nails on the kitchen tile, the whisper of her grandmother's worried prayers late at night. Tension reached a fever pitch as neighbors gossiped over fences, and Evelyn answered phone calls in hushed tones, refusing to let Sophie hear the words that stung like nettles. On the morning of the town hall hearing, Hollow Creek felt like it was holding its breath. Sophie awoke before dawn, unable to sleep, and wandered through the silent house. She found Ranger already awake, sitting by the back door, his gaze fixed on the horizon as if waiting for something or someone to return. His ears pricked when Sophie approached. She knelt beside him, threading her fingers through his coarse fur, and pressed her cheek to his neck. "You ready?" she whispered. Ranger closed his eyes, letting out a slow, steady breath. It was answer enough. Evelyn was up early too, hands trembling slightly as she poured coffee into mugs. "Big day," she said softly, setting a steaming cup in front of Sophie. "Your father always said, when things are darkest, look for the smallest bit of light. Sometimes that's all you need." Sophie nodded, clutching the mug, as if she could draw courage from its warmth. As they got ready to leave, Sophie ducked into the barn one last time, hoping for comfort. She sat on a bale of hay and absently ran her hand through the straw. Her fingers brushed against something hard, half buried beneath a loose board. Curious, she pulled it free. A battered ammo box, the kind her father had used in all those stories he'd told her before bed. Dust danced in the pale morning light as she fumbled with the latch, heart racing with a strange sense of anticipation. Inside, atop old photos and a faded patch from her father's uniform, lay a sealed envelope. The writing on the front was unmistakable. "To Sophie, if I don't come home." Her breath caught. She turned it over in her hands, fingers shaking, then tore it open. The paper was yellowed, the ink slightly smudged, but her father's handwriting was steady, as always. She began to read, the words wrapping around her like a blanket. "Dear Sophie, if you're reading this, I didn't make it home. I need you to know that I loved you more than words can ever say. I wish I could be there to watch you grow up, to see the person you'll become. There's something else you need to know about Ranger. He's more than a dog, Sophie. He's my partner, my friend, my heart wrapped in loyalty and fur. If I can't come back, I want you to take care of him. He'll find you, just like he always found me. Trust him. Love him. He'll be your protector now, just like he was mine. I'm so proud of you. Don't let anyone tell you what you can or cannot do. And remember, sometimes the bravest thing you can do is to forgive, even when it hurts. Love always." Dad Sophie pressed the letter to her chest, tears streaming down her cheeks, the ache of missing him sharper than ever. But in those lines she heard his voice, steady, gentle, sure. Ranger watched her silently, as if he too understood the weight of every word. With new determination, Sophie tucked the letter into her jacket and went back inside, meeting Evelyn's anxious gaze with a nod. "I'm ready," she said, voice steady. The town hall was packed, every seat filled, people standing shoulder to shoulder along the walls and spilling into the corridor. Cameras from the local news station flashed as Sophie entered, Ranger's leash in her hand, Evelyn at her side. The judge, a somber man with tired eyes, banged his gavel to bring the room to order. Councilman Royston launched into his arguments, brandishing his stack of incident reports like a shield. "We cannot allow this animal to threaten our children," he thundered. "The town's safety is at stake. I urge the court to order his immediate euthanasia." Sophie's heart pounded as she approached the front. She drew a deep breath and unfolded her father's letter, her hands trembling just enough for the judge to notice. She read aloud, her voice quivering but clear, each word echoing off the walls and reaching the crowd that had come to judge her. And Ranger. "He's more than a dog, Sophie. He's my partner, my friend, my heart wrapped in loyalty and fur." As she finished, the room was silent. Evelyn stepped forward, voice thick with emotion. "Ranger isn't just a dog. He's a hero, and he's all that's left of my son. Please, let him come home." The judge looked over his glasses, studying the girl and the scarred dog sitting so patiently by her feet. "Is there anyone else who wishes to speak?" he asked. Rachel Boone raised her hand. "I've known Ranger since his return. I've watched Sophie rebuild his trust, day by day. He isn't aggressive. He's grieving. They both are, but together, they're healing. Isn't that what we want for all of us?" Suddenly, Tommy's voice rang out from the back. "The video doesn't show the truth. Ranger didn't attack anyone. He was protecting Sophie. I lied because I was scared. Chase made it up." The confession rippled through the crowd like a shockwave. The judge called for order, then motioned for Chase to approach. After a long, tense silence, Chase hung his head and muttered, "It was my idea." I lied too. The words were barely audible, but their impact was immediate. Whispers ran through the crowd. Councilman Rustin's face turned pale with rage and embarrassment. The judge's gavel struck again. "I have heard enough," he declared. "Ranger is not a threat. Sophie, you have demonstrated responsibility and love. This court grants you full custody of Ranger. I hope the rest of this town learns something about compassion and about owning up to our mistakes." A wave of emotion crashed through Sophie. Evelyn sobbed openly, clutching her granddaughter in relief. Rachel smiled through tears, and Tommy gave Sophie a brave, apologetic wave. Chase slipped quietly from the room, his father storming after him. As the crowd dispersed, some approached Sophie and Evelyn with apologies, others in silence, but most with respect. Reporters clustered near the doors, their questions drowned out by the joy and relief that poured from Sophie and Evelyn. Ranger, sensing the change, wagged his tail and nuzzled Sophie's hand, his eyes bright for the first time since he'd come home. Outside, the late afternoon sun shone warm on their faces. Sophie knelt in the grass, wrapping her arms around Ranger's neck. "We did it, boy! We're going home! Together!" Ranger licked her cheek, his tail thumping like a drumbeat of hope. That evening, back at the farmhouse, Sophie pinned her father's letter to the wall above her bed. She read it once more before she fell asleep, Ranger curled up at her feet. A living promise that love and loyalty could outlast even the darkest days. And somewhere, Sophie felt her father's pride shining through, a beacon guiding them both forward. Change didn't sweep through Hollow Creek in a single day. But Sophie felt it blooming quietly, like wildflowers poking through broken sidewalk. The weight of the court's decision lifted something from her chest, and even the air on Evelyn's farm seemed lighter, less crowded by fear, more open to hope. For the first time in months, Sophie could take Ranger for a walk without checking over her shoulder, the world around them stretching wide with possibility. Ranger, too, was changing. The haunted look in his eyes softened, and a kind of eager curiosity replaced his old, restless pacing. He trotted at Sophie's side, sniffing at dandelions, and pausing to watch sparrows flit between the fence posts. His limp was still there, but even it seemed lighter, as if he'd finally decided that hope was worth the effort. Sophie had an idea she couldn't shake, something that first glimmered in her mind as she watched Ranger watch her, the way his whole body seemed to listen, not just his ears. She told Evelyn over breakfast, "He needs a job, Grandma. Dad always said Ranger was happiest when he had a purpose." Evelyn sipped her tea and nodded. "I think you're right, sweetheart. And maybe you need one, too." Rachel Boone stopped by with her own surprise. She'd brought a friend, Dr. Will McKay, a therapist who ran programs for veterans and children struggling with trauma. He watched quietly as Sophie ran Ranger through his hand signals, noting how the dog responded, slow at first, then with growing confidence. "He's special," Dr. McKay said, kneeling so his face was level with Ranger's. "Not just because of what he's been through, but because he wants to connect. That's rare." He explained his idea, a partnership, right there at Evelyn's farm. They would create a safe space, Ranger's Rest, where kids who had lost someone or felt lost themselves could come to heal. Sophie felt a jolt of excitement. He could help people, like he helped me. "Exactly," Dr. McKay said. "Sometimes all it takes is one friend who understands pain without words." They worked for weeks to prepare the barn, sweeping out old hay, hanging strings of colored lights, painting a mural with kids' handprints around the doorway. Sophie watched as volunteers, many of them veterans, some still carrying their own invisible wounds, came and went, their faces softening as Ranger approached them. Gentle and calm. The first group to visit included 6 children and their parents. Some of the kids were too shy to speak, others acted out, throwing pebbles or refusing to come inside. Ranger seemed to understand their uncertainty. He waited, lying on his side, tail wagging slowly, eyes soft and welcoming. A small boy named Caleb, hair sticking up in messy tufts, hid behind his mother's legs. Dr. McKay knelt beside him. "Would you like to say hello to Ranger?" Caleb shook his head, eyes wide. But Ranger stayed perfectly still, his gaze steady but never demanding. Sophie remembered her father's advice. Let them come to you. Patience is a language dogs and people both understand. So she sat cross-legged a few feet away and talked to Ranger in a low voice, telling him silly stories about the time he ate an entire pumpkin pie and looked absolutely unrepentant. After a while, Caleb edged closer. He crouched beside Sophie, saying nothing, just watching. Ranger turned his head and let out a soft woof. Then, as if in slow motion, he laid his head in Caleb's lap. The entire room seemed to hold its breath. Caleb stared, then reached out, fingers trembling, and touched Ranger's fur. For the first time all year, his mother saw him smile, a small, uncertain curve, but real. Dr. McKay whispered, "That's it. That's how it begins." The weeks that followed were filled with small miracles. A teenage girl who hadn't spoken in 6 months whispered secrets into Ranger's ear. A father and son, both grieving a fallen Marine, sat shoulder to shoulder and stroked Ranger's back, the silence between them finally easy. One afternoon, during group story time, a speech-delayed boy named Eli tugged on Ranger's ear and giggled. Then, clear as a bell, he whispered his very first word in a year. Safe. Word spread fast, faster than fear this time. Parents brought their children, veterans drove in from the next county, all drawn by stories of the dog, who understood grief without judgment. Ranger's Rest became a haven. The barn transformed into a place where sorrow wasn't hidden, but shared, and healing felt possible. Through it all, Sophie and Ranger were at the center. Every morning, they opened the gate together, Sophie holding the notebook of hand signals, Ranger watching her with trust and expectation. Every evening, Sophie would walk through the barn, collecting the drawings and thank you notes children left behind. You helped me feel brave. Ranger is my hero. Thank you for not giving up. There were hard moments, too, nights when Sophie would find Ranger staring at the moon, lost in memories only he could see. She would sit with him, reading her father's letter aloud, letting Ranger's steady heartbeat remind her that some scars never fully fade, but they didn't have to define you. One Friday afternoon, as the summer sun dipped low, Sophie noticed Ranger limping more than usual. She knelt beside him, concern tightening her chest. "Are you tired, old friend?" she asked softly. Evelyn came over, stroking Ranger's head. "You've given a lot of yourself, haven't you, boy?" she murmured. "Maybe tonight you rest a little closer to the fire." Sophie spread out a blanket by the wood stove, and Ranger settled down with a sigh, his body pressed close to hers. Dr. McKay joined them, sitting cross-legged on the floor. "He's changed so many lives," the therapist said. "You both have." Sophie thought about it long after the others went to bed. She stared at the drawings pinned up around the barn, the rainbow handprints, the poems, the photographs. She realized that this place, this Ranger's Rest, wasn't just about healing wounds. It was about honoring the past and believing in the future. It was about taking the hardest things, the pain, the loss, and turning them into something that made the world a little brighter. Late that night, as the embers in the stove glowed orange and Ranger's breathing steadied, Sophie whispered, "Thank you, Ranger, for finding me when I was lost." She traced her father's dog tag, the metal warm against her skin, and let herself believe that somewhere he was watching, proud of them both. In Hollow Creek, people began to see Ranger differently, not as a threat, but as a symbol of second chances. The place where he'd once been chained was now filled with laughter, the echoes of children's voices, and the gentle wisdom of a dog who had learned that, even after war and heartbreak, there is always more love to give. And in that peace, Sophie finally felt something she hadn't dared to hope for since the day her father left. She felt at home. Spring painted Hollow Creek in bright strokes of green and gold, wildflowers blooming even in the cracks of the old farm road. At Ranger's Rest, the barn doors stood wide open, welcoming a steady trickle of families and volunteers. Sophie had taken to greeting every car, her excitement contagious, Ranger by her side, his tail wagging slow but steady as a flag of peace. The place buzzed with preparation for the annual spring fair, a tradition in Hollow Creek, now reimagined as a fundraiser for the Trauma Recovery Center. Bunting fluttered between trees. Folding tables held baskets of homemade cookies and jars of wildflower honey, and the air was sweet with laughter and the distant strum of a guitar. Sophie moved through it all, clipboard in hand, double-checking the day's schedule. She wore her father's scarf looped around her neck, a gentle comfort against the nerves that still crept in whenever she remembered how close she'd come to losing Ranger. Evelyn manned the welcome table, Rachel Boone gave a quick tour to new families, and Dr. McKay set up a crafts corner where children painted riverstones with bright colors. But as Sophie walked Ranger toward the petting zoo, she caught sight of a car pulling up quietly by the fence. A familiar blue sedan, its paint flecked and dull. Chase Roston stepped out, face pale and pinched, his posture uncertain. His mother hovered in the driver's seat, not meeting anyone's eyes. Sophie's stomach twisted. It had been weeks since the council hearing, and since then, Chase had avoided school, slinking through town like a shadow. She'd almost convinced herself he'd never come back. But here he was, hands shoved deep in his pockets, not making eye contact as he approached the barn. Tommy, who was helping set up a row of pinwheels, noticed first. "Hey, Chase," he said, voice low but not unkind. Chase nodded, mumbling a greeting, his gaze skittering over the crowd until it landed on Sophie. Ranger's ears pricked, but he made no move. No bark, no growl, just a calm, steady regard. Sophie watched as Chase's jaw worked, his fingers twitching nervously. The memory of that night in the dog pen flickered in the space between them, full of regret and things left unsaid. Sophie took a breath, then gestured to a tray of seedlings meant for the memorial garden. "You want to help plant these? We could use an extra hand." She surprised herself with how steady her voice sounded. Chase hesitated, then gave a shaky nod. Tommy joined them, kneeling to dig small holes for the flowers. "We're planting these for the soldiers who didn't make it home," he explained softly, "and for anyone who needs a second chance." Chase's eyes flickered, and Sophie saw the truth of Tommy's words land with gentle force. They worked in silence for a while, the warm earth crumbling between their fingers, the air filled with birdsong and the distant shouts of children playing games. Finally, Chase set his trowel aside, wiping his hands on his jeans. He looked up and found Ranger standing just a few feet away, watching him. Ranger stepped forward, slow and deliberate, his limp barely noticeable on the soft ground. He stopped in front of Chase and sat, eyes steady. The moment stretched, a current of tension, fear, and hope threading through the afternoon light. Every conversation nearby seemed to pause, as if the whole fair was waiting for what would happen next. Chase swallowed, kneeling until he was eye level with the big German shepherd. His voice was barely more than a whisper. "I was scared of what I didn't understand." He glanced at Sophie, shame and longing tangled in his expression. "I'm sorry, Ranger. I'm sorry, Sophie, for everything." Ranger simply stared, tail brushing the grass, ears relaxed. He didn't flinch or turn away. Instead, he reached forward and nudged Chase's arm with his nose. A quiet acceptance. An olive branch between past and present. Sophie watched, heart pounding, as Chase reached out a trembling hand and let it rest on Ranger's broad head. No one said a word, but the forgiveness in that gesture was louder than any apology. Ranger let out a gentle woof, closing his eyes, leaning into Chase's touch. Tommy nodded, a smile pulling at the corners of his mouth. He remembers, but he forgives, too. Sophie echoed the thought, her voice quiet. Everyone's scared sometimes. What matters is what you do, after. The tension that had clung to Chase seemed to melt. He glanced at Sophie, and for the first time since that night, she saw something new in his eyes. Not fear, not guilt, but a fragile hope. Thanks, he said, voice rough, for letting me help. They finished planting in companionable silence, 3 pairs of hands working the soil, Ranger stretched out beside them, a living bridge across old divides. The crowd slowly resumed its cheerful noise, but every so often, someone glanced at the unlikely trio with a kind of wonder, as if witnessing a small miracle. The rest of the day unfolded in a blur of activity. Children braided ribbons into Ranger's fur, Families toured the barn, and parents snapped photos beneath the Rangers' Rest sign. At the crafts table, Evelyn and Dr. McKay led a group of kids in making paper lanterns, symbols of hope to be released into the night sky. Chase and Tommy stuck close to Sophie, helping with games and handing out lemonade, their laughter genuine, their burdens lighter. That evening, as dusk fell and the fair wound down, the community gathered for a moment of remembrance at the new garden. Sophie, Tommy, and Chase stood together, each holding a lantern. Sophie spoke quietly. "We plant flowers for the ones we miss, and for new beginnings. Thank you for believing in second chances." She released her lantern, watching it float upward, carried on a gentle breeze, a tiny point of light against the gathering darkness. Chase's lantern drifted alongside hers. He looked at her, tears bright in his eyes, and whispered, "Thank you." Tommy joined them, arms slung around both shoulders, and for the first time, Sophie felt the shape of something whole forming in her chest. Friendship, forgiveness, the healing only truth could bring. After everyone left, Sophie lingered by the barn, Ranger at her side. She knelt in the cool grass and hugged him tight. "You did it, buddy. You brought us all together." Ranger pressed his nose into her shoulder, eyes shining with the wisdom of someone who had survived so much and chosen to trust again. And as the first stars appeared, Sophie realized what her father had meant about forgiveness. Sometimes, the bravest thing you could do was to welcome someone back, to let the past be just that, and reach for what might come next. In that quiet, beneath the night sky, and surrounded by the friends she'd made and the family she'd kept, Sophie found peace. The first days of summer break arrived on a wave of golden light, transforming Hollow Creek Middle School from a place of whispers and worry into a bright, bustling hub of end-of-year excitement. For Sophie, the auditorium felt both enormous and intimate, the rows of folding chairs filled with students, parents, and teachers, faces she'd seen all her life, now turned toward the low stage where she sat waiting, clutching her essay in trembling hands. It was the school's annual essay contest, an event Sophie had never dared to enter before. This year was different. With Ranger by her side, hope swelling in her chest, she'd written from a place of honesty that frightened and freed her at the same time. The theme was Courage in Our Community, and she'd titled her piece, Ranger's Way. Backstage, Ranger waited quietly, his thick coat brushed to a gleam, the scars on his legs visible but no longer ugly. Children stopped by to pat his head, some whispering secrets in his ears, others simply smiling as they passed. Teachers who'd once eyed him with suspicion now greeted him as an old friend, giving Sophie small nods of encouragement. Evelyn and Rachel Boone sat together in the front row, faces lit with pride. Dr. McKay held his phone, ready to record, determined to capture this milestone for the Rangers' Rest scrapbook. As the principal called her name, Sophie's breath caught. The world seemed to slow as she walked to the microphone, Ranger falling into step beside her. A hush settled over the room, the kind reserved for moments when everyone senses that something important is about to unfold. She unfolded her essay, hands only shaking a little, and began to read. When people talk about heroes, they think of capes and medals, of people who run into burning buildings or save the day with a single act. But sometimes a hero is quiet. Sometimes he waits instead of running. Sometimes he remembers so the rest of us can forget, just for a little while. My hero is a dog. His name is Ranger. Sophie's voice grew stronger with each line, her eyes sweeping the room, catching the glimmer of recognition in veterans' faces, the tears brimming in parents' eyes, the hope flickering in children who'd found a friend in Ranger over the past months. He didn't bark for attention. He waited. He watched. And when I needed him most, he remembered who he was. Ranger remembers everything. He remembers the desert where my dad was his partner, the home he lost, the nights he slept alone, so no one else had to be afraid. He remembers kindness and cruelty, laughter and silence, but most of all, he remembers how to give hope back to those who feel lost. As she spoke, Ranger paced quietly onto the stage. The entire auditorium held its breath as he walked to her side and lay down at her feet, head resting on her shoe, a living punctuation mark to every word she read. The principal wiped at his eyes. A few parents covered their mouths. Tommy and Chase, sitting near the front, exchanged a smile. No longer adversaries, but friends. Sophie continued, her words steady. Some people think dogs forget, but Ranger didn't forget my dad, and he didn't forget me. He didn't forget how to be gentle, even when the world wasn't gentle with him. And that's the lesson he taught me. Loyalty doesn't ask for applause. It doesn't need an audience. It just is. Her essay closed with a soft, powerful truth. Sometimes the bravest people, and animals, are the ones who carry pain, but still choose to love. Ranger's way is quiet. But it's enough to hold this family, and maybe even this whole town, together. The auditorium was silent for a beat, the kind of silence that only comes after something true has been spoken. Then, applause thundered, rolling over Sophie and Ranger like a wave. Evelyn pressed a hand to her heart. Rachel Boone dabbed her eyes. Dr. McKay caught the whole moment on camera. Ranger, unbothered by the ovation, yawning and nudging closer to Sophie, as if to say, "We did good, kid." After the ceremony, veterans lingered by the stage, some shaking Sophie's hand, others kneeling to scratch Ranger behind the ears. One, a tall man with a silver beard and haunted eyes, handed Sophie a battered patch from his uniform. "You take care of him," he said quietly. "He's the best kind of soldier there is." Sophie nodded, voice caught in her throat, emotion blooming deep and warm. Kids clustered around for pictures with Ranger, their stories tumbling out, how he'd helped them through the loss of a pet, the divorce of their parents, the nightmares that wouldn't go away. Parents thanked Sophie, some apologizing for what they'd once believed about Ranger. Even Chase and Tommy joined in, their easy laughter proof that healing had taken root, growing into something strong and lasting. Later, back at Ranger's Rest, the community gathered for an informal party. Paper lanterns, painted with the names of lost loved ones and wishes for the future, floated above the fields as the sun set. Children took turns reading their essays, proud and shy, their words mingling with the soft rustle of the wind. Sophie found herself sitting beside Evelyn, Ranger sprawled between them, his chin on her knee. "You know," Evelyn said, "I think your dad would be awfully proud, not just of you, but of how you never gave up on this dog. Or yourself." Sophie smiled, tracing the letters on her father's old dog tag. "I think Ranger remembers Dad better than anyone," she whispered. "And I think he's teaching all of us to remember what matters." As night fell, and the last lantern drifted upward, Sophie stood and called to the crowd. "Ranger reminded me that sometimes healing doesn't happen all at once. Sometimes it happens little by little, in every act of kindness, every time we choose to trust again. He's more than a hero. He's family." A hush settled. Then a single voice, a child's, rose in the darkness. "Thank you, Ranger." The crowd echoed it, laughter and applause rolling out into the night, washing away the last of the old fear, planting seeds of hope that would bloom long after this summer faded. Ranger, eyes shining, lifted his head and let out a deep, contented sigh, his body relaxed, at peace. In that moment, Sophie knew that memory wasn't just about pain. It was about carrying forward the best parts of the past, sharing them with others, and never letting go of the belief that even the quietest presence could be the one that held a whole world together. And as the moon rose over Hollow Creek, Sophie and Ranger sat side by side, watching the lights dance on the fields, knowing that, no matter what, their story had only just begun. The years that followed the summer of Ranger's Way changed Hollow Creek in ways no one could have predicted. What began as one girl's fight for a wounded dog became the spark that transformed not only a town, but the lives of everyone who passed through the gates of Ranger's Rest. On a late afternoon, in early fall, sunlight slanted gold through the branches of the memorial oak, its roots hugging the earth where Ben Fletcher's dog tags hung from a brass plaque. At the tree's base, Ranger lay in the dappled light, his once sleek muzzle now silvered with age, eyes half closed in gentle contentment. Next to him, a small puppy tumbled and barked, chasing the drifting leaves. Scout, Sophie's new rescue, full of wild hope and boundless energy. Sophie, now older and taller, watched them from the porch, a smile curving her lips as she wiped her hands on her jeans. The farmhouse had changed too, its walls covered with photos, drawings, and thank you notes from hundreds of children and veterans who had found their way to Ranger's Rest. The barn, once echoing with silence and pain, now buzzed with laughter and the quiet work of healing. Evelyn, her hair whiter and her steps slower, hung another set of dog tags on the memorial wall inside the barn. Each one told a story of a soldier who'd found peace, a child who'd found courage, a family that found hope where there once was only grief. Rachel Boone walked the grounds with Dr. McKay, checking in on the families who had come for the weekend's group retreat. Parents, siblings, and kids, each carrying a loss, each hoping for a new beginning. Sophie had taken on more responsibility at the center. She led groups through the woods, showing them where wild violets grew, telling stories about Ranger's earliest days at the farm. She showed them the old notebook of hand signals, passing on her father's lessons, her own voice sure and warm. But it was Ranger who remained the heart of it all. Even as his steps slowed and his naps grew longer, his gentle presence drew people in. Veterans knelt beside him, whispering old secrets or just sitting in silence. Children who struggled to speak found their first words patting his head. Even Scout, full of puppy mischief, settled beside the old dog when dusk fell, comforted by his steady breathing. On the anniversary of Ben Fletcher's homecoming, the entire community gathered beneath the oak. A new group of children sat in a circle, each holding a small lantern. Sophie welcomed them, her voice bright. Sometimes, the ones we think need saving are the ones who save us. She told the story of Ranger, how he'd come home carrying wounds no one could see, how he'd learned to trust again, how his love had become the anchor for so many others. The ceremony was simple. A local veteran, one of the first Ranger had helped, stepped forward, placing his own set of dog tags on the wall. He knelt by Ranger, his voice thick. "Thank you, Ranger, for showing me that it's never too late to start over." He pressed his hand to the old dog's head, eyes shining with gratitude. Evelyn read a poem. Rachel and Dr. McKay shared stories from the past year, the boy who spoke his first word, the family who found laughter again after a father's passing, the veteran who learned to forgive himself. Each tale wove another thread into the fabric of Ranger's Rest, binding everyone closer. As dusk fell, the children released their lanterns into the twilight, each one a promise to remember, to hope, to love bravely. Sophie knelt beside Ranger, pressing her forehead to his. "You did so much, old friend. You gave everyone your heart." She traced the gray in his fur, the wisdom in his eyes, knowing this moment would linger long after both of them were gone. Scout bounded up, nuzzling under Ranger's chin. The old dog opened one eye, then nudged the pup closer to Sophie's side. It was his way of saying, "Go on, kid. The world needs you now." Sophie laughed, wiping her tears. "I'll take care of him, just like you took care of me." Later, as the party faded and the fireflies flickered in the long grass, Sophie found herself alone with Ranger under the oak. The farm was quiet, except for the soft sounds of Scout dreaming nearby. She read her father's letter once more, the paper thin and soft with age, the words forever strong. We can't always stop pain, but we can choose what we do with it. Ranger didn't chase medals. He waited for the right moment to help someone else stand tall. She looked down at Ranger, feeling his heartbeat slow but strong beneath her hand. "You waited for me. You waited for all of us," she whispered. "You're the bravest dog I've ever known." As the moon climbed high, a group of veterans stood quietly at the memorial wall, each pressing their own dog tags beside Ben's. One whispered, "Rest easy, Ranger. You've done enough." The others nodded, and the simple tribute seemed to echo across the fields and into the hearts of everyone who'd ever needed to believe that hope could survive the hardest trials. Time moved gently after that. Ranger spent his days beneath the tree, watching the younger dogs play, greeting new arrivals with his soft, patient eyes. The farm continued to bloom, gardens overflowing, children's laughter drifting across the fields, The old barn painted with murals that told the story of how one dog changed everything. Eventually the day came when Ranger's body grew too tired to rise. Sophie lay beside him, Scout tucked close, Evelyn holding his paw, and everyone who had loved him gathered around. It was quiet, peaceful. There were tears, but there was also gratitude, a deep, abiding sense that Ranger's love had made the world just a little softer, a little braver. Sophie stood before the crowd at Ranger's memorial, her voice clear and strong. We all have scars. Ranger taught me that. He taught me that healing comes not from forgetting, but from loving, again and again, even when it's hard. She smiled through her tears, gesturing to the children and veterans and families. He taught me that sometimes the smallest light can guide us home. She looked at the new group of children, Scout now napping at her feet. If you ever feel alone, look for someone who needs you. Remember Ranger's way. Patience, loyalty, love, without asking for anything back. And never forget, sometimes healing comes on four legs, with eyes that have seen everything but still choose love. The crowd clapped softly, lanterns glowing in the dusk. As night swept across the farm, the story of Ranger became a legend in Hollow Creek. A story told at bedtime, remembered at every celebration, cherished by every soul who learned that kindness is its own kind of courage. And high above the farm, under the vast, quiet sky, a spirit ran free, forever loyal, forever loved, always waiting for the next heart to heal,